Um, oh, there we go. um, so, um, my name's Teal. I'll give myself a brief intro. I am not on, my full-time job is with something called the Veritas Forum. That is we do like talks on college campuses around like Christianity in the public square kinds of stuff. But my kind of heart in so many ways is with HCFA. I was full time for 5 years, and then I met my husband, and we moved to Indiana, and all the things. So, yeah, have been out of full time kind of HCFA contact for a couple of years, but then popped back in this year, and who knows what the Lord has. So, I love it. I love teaching. I love hanging out with you guys. It is just a complete and utter joy. And I really love it when people talk back. So if you are a brave soul, particularly considering the topic, would love any kind of feedback. I know Zoom is just like so less than ideal, but we all are living this life together and surviving. So, and yeah, so don't feel like you need to raise your hand or do anything, like just jump in if something's unclear, if you have a question. I am going to a couple times like prompt with some questions, and just would love for you guys to kind of engage. Sound good? We good? Awesome. So Proverbs, so here's the deal. It's a little dangerous to teach a Bible study you've never been to. Tuesdays have been crazy for me all summer. And so if I'm repeating things that other people have taught on, which I most certainly will, you can just chalk it up to wisdom is nothing if not repeated. So there you go. I've been thinking about, so Gina and I kind of have this joke because Proverbs is like, Gina has been ABCLing, which is like kind of the student leader in my graduating senior Bible course this past year. And we have a joke about Proverbs and how much I am like so not into it, right? Which is kind of scandalous. And I love the Old Testament, but I think wisdom literature is probably my weakest area of just like deep kind of formative love. But in prepping for this and thinking about like, as you guys are processing like what wisdom looks like, and particularly around this topic, I felt like, oh my gosh, this is actually the perfect book to be talking about dating. And marriage, because I think we talk all the time about like the ancient world did not have a concept for dating in the way that we do. Like they just don't. So you're not gonna like, there's no verse you look up for dating, right? Everything is sort of like, there are obviously a ton of principles and a ton of connections, but they're not, it's not a familiar kind of parlance in scripture. And so as I've counseled students over the years, as I dated, I had a long season of singleness. I got married when I was got married in my mid 30s. And just like the role of wisdom in this particular area, I think is not to be ignored. So, yeah, just want to jump in. If you have a Bible near you, I think that's probably going to be the best way, because we're going to be jumping around a lot. Or just pull up like Bible Gateway or something on your computer. But I'm going to kind of run through kind of 3 areas that felt like kind of relevant in Proverbs as we talk about this. There's nothing magical in the 3 things that jumped out at me, but I think when we think about Proverbs, it feels to me like the overarching question of Proverbs is, do you want wisdom? Like, is that something you're interested in? And I think before we even engage anything else, that question is there for us, right? And so I think that's a question, not sort of for us to like rhetorically sort of be like, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought. But to really say, like, are we looking for wisdom? And are we looking for wisdom in like areas that are like kind of intimate and connected to like deep desire or pain, or right? Like are we open to that? So I think that's the kind of first, like, that's a bit of the setting, I think, for any reader of Proverbs, which we are. So I just wanted to sit with that for a second. One of the refreshing things to me about Proverbs is there is no world in which you come in to the quest for wisdom and you're like, oh, some people have naturally have wisdom and some people don't. You know, the whole premise of Proverbs is like you're all simple, right? Is sort of the word. Like we are level playing field in terms of need. And so there's just like zero shame in the invitation of Proverbs to like come and get wisdom. And wisdom, I'm using that word as like applied knowledge. So not just like, hey, I know something's a good idea or would be smart to do, but like I like am beginning to like put it into practice. I think Fetty used kind of the attitude and action kind of language, which I think is so good. This sense of like there's some kind of internal like heart posture, but there's also some kind of working out of that thing, some like provenness to it. And applied knowledge takes practice. Like you can get a ton of like learning, right? And you guys have a ton of learning and you will continue to get a lot of learning. But in order to put it into practice, you just need opportunities. And so by virtue of that fact, in general, people further ahead of you in life are going to have more wisdom. Now, one of the most tragic things is when that's not the situation, right? And it often is, unfortunately, not the situation. But in general, sort of thinking about wisdom as like something that we gain over time as we like practice the fear of God, as we like brush up against mature believers, as we grow ourselves, is actually like really wonderful. Like you just don't need to have arrived, and you never are going to, right? But there is like a real prospect for growth in that way. So a couple of questions I'm going to ask rhetorically. Here's what I would love for you to do. Pull up, either handwrite, I'm going to give us like a minute or two, handwrite, or just like the notes section of your computer or whatever you would prefer. What's your sort of gut response when it's like, hey, we're going to talk about dating and marriage? Like just sort of your like one-off, like, this is how I'm feeling about that general topic. This is what it sort of brings up in me. If you have any sense of like your main, I don't even want to say teachers, but sort of like influences around the topic of relationships. And then what questions do you have that if we don't cover, you're going to feel like, man, that was a real loss? And I am going to ask you to chat those, which will not pick up on the recording, just to be clear, and I won't use your name. But let's do those first two things just in the notes section, and then I'll give you about a minute. So general feelings, attitudes, response to dating and marriage, and then kind of sense of influences around that particular subject in your life. Thanks, Tyler. All right. Give me a second to wrap up. Okay, and would love for you to, if you have questions that you want to pop into the chat, that would be super helpful for me. And of course, feel free to also just interject at any point. How many of you, just I can, for those of you who I can see your faces, like give me like thumbs up if it was generally positive, thumbs down if it was generally negative, in terms of your like kind of gut response, and like, you know, like give me a gauge. Awesome. Okay, so mostly positive to neutral for the most part. Okay, so helpful. Thanks, guys. No, I mean, I think it's like any number of responses are met. Probably the negatives just opted out, let's be honest. They're like, no thanks. I would prefer not to have this conversation. I want to just acknowledge on the front end that like this is an area where people are just coming from all different directions for a ton of reasons. And so that is okay. Wherever you're coming from, like whether you've thought a lot about this, whether you haven't thought at all about it, whether this feels something that's pretty integrated with how you're thinking about faith or not, right? Like any of those things. Pre-fresh, we do our Bible courses, which you will hear much about very soon. Our freshman spring, Bursa could tell you, is we spend a lot of time on something we call sex and spirituality. So this is not going to be sex and spirituality, but I will tell you that like this is something we talk a lot about in HCFA, because it matters a ton. And we're all operating with a lot of assumptions and questions and all of those things. So, all right. So I want us to jump in with Proverbs 8 and 9, which I think is like a fantastic framing device. Should have mentioned that what you just sort of took note of, I want you to hang on to for your breakout groups, so you can sort of process that. And then maybe you'll have some shifts. We'll see. But I mean, Proverbs 8 and 9 to me is like the heart of the book. It is this gorgeous extended metaphor about lady wisdom, and then this kind of like little section of like folly, right? So we get these two like female personifications of, right, like the wisdom virtue, and then kind of foolishness or folly, which are both huge themes in the book of Proverbs. So we get, I mean, it starts with 8:1, right? Does not wisdom call, right? So there's this sense of like wisdom is like leaning out of her window, basically. In verse 4, to you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of man. O simple ones, right? All of you. Learn prudence. O fools, learn sense. Hear, for I will speak noble things. And from my lips will come what is right, for my mouth will utter truth, right? And she just kind of introduces herself. And then we get this really interesting, starting in verse 22. The Lord possessed me, or Yahweh, right, possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. This is a really famous passage that's talking about wisdom being present at creation. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. So there's this like beautiful metaphor, and really this sense of like the ancientness of wisdom and this inextricable connection with the creator, right? That there is like the possessor of wisdom is God, right? And the access point for wisdom is God, right? And we get that throughout Proverbs. But I love this. Check out verse 30. So it's like God is creating and wisdom is right there. Then I was beside him, God, like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man. And now, O sons, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. So there's this sense of like the wisdom as a builder. And then we get that same theme picked up, right? Builder of sort of the foundation of the earth. And then verse 1 of chapter 9, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars, which 7 in sort of Old Testament lingo just means like there's perfection there, wholeness. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. So we get like this sense of like wisdom building a house and then sort of like being a house in a sense as well. So there's this beautiful banquet table, like here's the feast that is like wisdom. And she's builds and delights in what's been built and is also sort of depicted as this like shelter or home as well. Like come in here and you'll be safe. Come in here and you'll be well fed. Like there's just this like gorgeous, it makes me think of like when Harry gets to Hogwarts, right? And there's just like, he's like, holy crap, I've never seen this level of like extravagance, right? It's like wisdom is like, come, like you're hungry, you need, like, come sit down, right? I've got this for you. Contrasted, of course, with Lady Folly, right? Which is like a little bit more of like a Hansel and Gretel situation, right? Like there's same call. Whoever's simple, let him turn in here in verse 16 of chapter 9. And yet, right, there's this stolen water is sweet and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, right? Like there's this like contrast with like a house of life and a house of death. So what is the personification of these things? Like why bother? Like what is gained in the way that these are set out? Or what might the author be trying to depict? You can talk. But thank you, Caleb. Caleb, what does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I guess it's like what is gained by that? It's in some ways like, I guess the author also feels like, well, what would be lost if wisdom were just conceived as like sayings from a father to a son, or individual habits or attitudes or learned things. It's like a way of saying that this wisdom, which was passed down from the father to son in the first chapter, and then these sayings, which will come later, has something to do not just about us, but about God and the world we live in.
Okay.
I think it might be to like almost personalize it and quite literally make wisdom more human, I guess. My mom always tells me that when a person who speaks 2 languages is 2 people, because that like extra facet of your own knowledge gives you like kind of like Caleb was saying a new worldview, but also just creates a greater level of depth to your own personality. And I think that that the author, in this case Solomon, might be wanting to personify wisdom to actually like show that it's accessing another part of yourself almost.
I love that. What else?
Yeah, building off what Amin said, which I thought was really great. Like wisdom is not this sort of like theoretical concept. It's like Amin said, it's like personified as a woman. But the interesting thing is that folly is also personified as a woman, and both of them are like making invitations.
Yep.
Like they're like, come live with me.
Yep.
And also like a little beyond that as well. Like for instance, Lady Folly is described as, which I think is just devastating. But in verse 13, the woman Folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. Like that's pretty devastating. But it's sort of like, it's more than just sort of like, you know, a simple person is being simple. It's like they are sort of submitting themselves to the seductiveness of this woman. They sort of choose to go sleep with this woman, or choose to go and like have this woman be a part of their lives, like enter into relationship with unwisdom or simpleness, or stupidity or whatever. And we are kind of always being invited to either participate in wisdom, to like form a relationship with wisdom, or to form a relationship with unwisdom. I think that's what I get from the personifications and stuff.
That's good, Tyler. I love that. Yeah, it really is like a doorway into a world in a sense, right? It's like, hey, I mean, and the sense I get is that wisdom, you sort of enter wisdom's house and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was going to be so amazing, right? Like, what a great spread. I just thought I was here for like coffee and it's like brunch, you know? And that the opposite is true of folly, right? That there's this sense of like, I got sold a bill of goods that was like actually devastating, right? Yeah, I think to just underscore also this sense of like wisdom as a person, you know, wisdom is nothing if not it is not a formula. It just isn't, right? And people aren't formulas. People are more complicated and nuanced, and I think this reminder that sometimes virtue speak can be oversimplifying. I think even kind of in its best form, it often is. I think Proverbs is limited at times by that because it's the genre, right? Like that, I'm sure you guys have already talked about, but just a reminder, like these aren't promises. Proverbs aren't promises. Just because you do something, with great virtue doesn't mean that it always turns out well for you, right? And so this reminder of, I think, the world, the kind of world building that's happening midway through Proverbs here, I think is just a reminder of complexity. And I think that's super important for us to remember when we talk about relational wisdom, in particular, because you are dealing with people. So wisdom has, and I think people with wisdom have this high, part of wisdom is like a high EQ, right? That there's this sense of sort of like relating. I want to talk about wisdom as a house because I also want to talk about it as we talk about marriage and dating. It is deeply connecting, right? That wisdom gets lived out in and through connections, right? Connections with God, connections with others. And so this idea of a household is super important. If we contrast, like thinking about another kind of key woman who's present at creation, right? We're talking about Eve, right? And if we contrast sort of Eve with Lady Wisdom, we get a sense that like, even if interdependence is inevitable, right? In the human experience, that there in one telling, like sin invades through the lie of independence and narcissism, right? The sense that like sort of like, what I do is not connected to what other people, like I make my own choices, I make my own decisions. I don't need other people telling me what to do. And like this sort of like sneaky narcissism that I think can just creep in and sort of tell us the lie that we are kind of central to the whole operation. So one of the things that wisdom in Proverbs is doing, and wisdom in life is doing, is bringing us back to the connectedness of all things and the impact of our decisions. There's in Proverbs 19, there's this great verse that says, houses and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord, or like a wise woman, right? Like there's this sense of like, you can get some other things like through people, but like there's this sense of like, man, wisdom, like the Lord is the one who gives like wise people, and you better be so grateful that he does when those people are deeply connected to you, right? So in kind of going back to the house thing, the home is so deeply central to the ancient world, and so much of Proverbs has like the scope of the home. So I don't think it's an accident that we give this like the home as places, because those kind of the home as central to the operation. Wendell Berry, who's an amazing, if you haven't read anything by Wendell Berry, do it. Talks about, he has this quote that there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places, right? Is this sense that like, the like homes become, and I actually think part of the call to Christian living is this call to like sort of re-enchant the household, by which I don't just mean like married with 2.5 children. That my goal in life for you guys as I disciple some of you and as staff and other people in here is not that you become a great suburban Christian. like and maybe that's where the Lord calls you, but this sense of like household in the biblical sense, which we'll talk more about. Dylan, I think you are unmuted. So yeah, I want to kind of bring this to like thinking about the household actually as like a central like discipline of dreaming with the Lord into your future. So many of you are doing career and vocational dreaming probably. Some of you are just dreaming about like what college is going to be like, and those dreams got a little messy this week. So like as you sort of project beyond college, which is closer for some of you than others, I want to encourage you to do the work of like really praying like for a vision of your future. I think that so in terms of applying, so been talking about wisdom connected to like the household. I think the application point for today, when that could feel so A, far away, and B, like antiquated and sort of stuffy, is that like no matter what your job is, your living situation will be the place you come home to, right? And the people who are there and to whom you are connected, like are going to make up like this integral part of your daily life. And that will be true for the rest of your life, right? And so I don't doubt that many of you are dreaming about romance. I want to encourage you to dream about a home and what that would look like. And I've counseled so many students, and I just actually was texting with an alum who I dearly love, but is making some relationship decisions that are like not what I would choose for her. And we've had some great conversations around that. But the reality is like love is not enough. Like feelings of love are not going to make automatically for a great marriage. When Jeff and I were dating, we got to this like, there are like a couple of points usually in a relationship where you kind of hit a crossroads. And we just like had gotten pretty stuck. And I was kind of like, what are we doing? Where are we going? He was sort of in a weird place. And praise God, like my husband really, hears from God. And so he was being really prayerful about kind of next thing that he felt like the Lord said to him, like, ask her what she wants for the future, like what kind of life. And that actually prompted a conversation that like was the breakthrough. Because I think as we just had this sense of like, hey, like I might love you, but if God isn't calling us to the same thing, or if we're not on the same page about some really critical things, that might mean that we don't get married. Right. And so that has to be, I think, reintegrated as we think about like wisdom for dating. I want to sort of reintegrate these like what might feel like a little pragmatic, but I think ultimately ends up being really essential for decision making in the economy of God. Because a household is actually like it's like a micro economy of God's kingdom. Right? So if as Christians, like if you are a Christian, you are engaged in kingdom building. That's what your call is, right? And that means a ton of things. It has like really cool implications and different implications for all of us, but towards the same goal, right? If we're in line with the Spirit. And so there's this sense of like you're building like a society within a greater economy. And so really thinking about like, hey, if I were going to like start a company, I would have these conversations with my fellow entrepreneur, right? With my partner in crime. I want to suggest that those same things are really helpful as you start thinking about your future. And you might be like, this is so irrelevant to me right now, but that's actually the best time to hear it because then you can just like store it away and it's a little nugget for later. But Jesus, of course, expands this from the biological family. And again, if Tyler's sort of making the nod to things we talk about in HCFA all the time, this is a strong one. Like I think that call is as much there as a single person, right? To be engaged in like micro kingdom building activities, to dream with others, to think about, if you know Andy Crouch, he's a author and sort of Christian thinker. And he used to like ages ago work at Harvard in campus ministry. And he, long before my time, but he and I were talking a couple of years ago, and he was talking about the house he lived in as a campus minister with a bunch of other campus ministers, and they like pooled their money. They basically had like a straight up Acts like situation going on, right? In terms of just regular prayer, regular worship, regular practice of hospitality, sharing of resources, all of these things. And I mean, that might feel so extreme, but my suggestion is that like, I don't think we have well considered the kind of ways of living in a household and in a family or in a kind of like constructed family as followers of Jesus in all the ways we could. I think there's so much untapped creativity in that realm. Tyler, I would love to hear your thoughts on this because I feel like you've also thought a lot about kind of these things.
Is there a specific question like thinking about constructed family?
I think you like in your maybe like how this has worked itself out for you, if it has.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I think that there's a couple folks. First of all, hey Maria, good to see you. There are a couple like kind of groups of people for whom the gospel's approach to family is really essential. So I'm thinking here about anybody who was born as a single person, which is everyone, right? I'm thinking also of people who maybe haven't dated somebody or might not date somebody in their lives and they don't know it yet, might not get married in their lives and they don't know it yet.
Yeah.
And there's this like very fascinating idea that the savior of the universe, right, the one whose life we're meant to emulate, like we imitate Jesus, right, and as we do that, we are progressively conformed to the image of God. It's really interesting that our like society tells us that like a dating relationship or a marriage relationship is kind of essential to what it means to be human. That you're almost like, there's this idea of like a soulmate, right? Which has as its implication that you are not complete until you like find the person who like completes your soul, the person who's your better half, if that makes sense. And yet the guy who is the most human that ever existed, which is Jesus, actually never had a dating or marital relationship in his life. But what he did have, like he certainly had brothers and sisters, like biological brothers and sisters, but Jesus is actually constantly kind of going around and undermining the idea of this nuclear family in some sense, where one time his siblings, or sometime, I guess one point, like some people come up to him and they're talking to him about his mother and his siblings, and he says, instead of sort of affirming them as the people who are actually his biological family and placing the precedent of their importance as like the top priority in his life, he instead says, who is my mother, who is my brother, who are my sisters? And he looks and points to the people who are not biologically related to him, but who have been like following him around because they're his disciples. And so like for Jesus, some of the closest relationships in his life are not biological relationships, even though some are, right? He's really close with his mom, Mary. But most of the closest relationships in his life are not biological relationships. And some of you will be called to be married in your lives. Some of you will be called to, some HCFAers have been called to get married while at Harvard, right? That has happened for sure. And it's mind-blowing and amazing. But some of you will also be called to date in college as well. And then there will be some of you who will not be called to those things during college. But don't miss the opportunity. This is the last thing I should say, I think, is don't miss the opportunity to experience the kinds of mind-blowingly close and character building and just super fun relationships that you'll be able to have with your friends who are not biologically related to you. And you'll meet a lot of those people in HCFA. And these are people who actually, like, having a sort of network like this, people who are your like closest friends, people who you like open your life to. Like I have one friend named Nate, for instance, who I like, he knows everything that there is to know about me. Every dark secret that I thought I was going to take to the grave, like me and this guy are so close that he knows all that stuff about me, which can be kind of intimidating. But like once you are able to be that transparent with another person and like feel that safe with another person, the quality of friendship there is mind-blowing. But like he's also somebody I'm going to trust a lot if I end up dating somebody, you know what I mean? Like if I'm like in this point where I'm trying to figure out, like, should I marry this person? Like he's going to be one of the people that I trust the most to give me wisdom, because he knows me the best in a lot of ways. And he might have a lot of proximity. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was a perfect segue.
yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna stop talking now. But
No. I wasn't trying to. That wasn't a hint.
Yeah.
But no, I think, yeah. So thinking about like the kind of household, re-enchanting that idea and expanding it in light of Jesus and what he does, I think is critical. But then secondly, to Tyler's point, thinking about thinking about like the idea of generational wisdom, right? Like, where are we going for wisdom, right? And I think there can be this gut response to reading Proverbs, and it's like, we're going to Proverbs for wisdom. And I think a lot of what the Old Testament is saying is like, oh my goodness, like you are going to the people around you, right? And so sort of like, how do we think about that? A couple really like obvious, but I'm going to just like loop back because I think it's really important. Proverbs 1, 8 and 9, right? Like, I mean, this entire book is, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck, right? Like that there is this like, hey, listen to your parents. This is such a, like, it's so baked in to Israel, to the Israelite community, that there's a really famous and very like memorizable and like sort of necessary for memorizing if you're, it's like the first thing you learn if you are a Hebrew child, in Deuteronomy 6. And it starts with, and this is probably going to sound familiar to you, it's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And how does that get transmitted? And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. In other words, like all the time, as you're in your home, and kind of out in society. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, right? There's this sense of like transmission of wisdom coming through the elders to the children. Proverbs 3, very similar, right? Like, hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive, right? And then he says, when I was a son with my father, right? Like there's this sense of like, again, that's like multi-generational passing down. So similarly, I think this can cause this kind of like thinking about how we transmit knowledge. Like when I think about how wisdom generally sort of comes to us, and I'm so curious, but you guys will have to talk in your groups, like how you feel like you kind of came upon your own like cache of wisdom around relationships, if you feel like you have one. Sometimes I think just as often, our families provide us with actually like the opposite of wisdom, or things that feel like we need to get over or like recover from. And again, this is where like Jesus is so, I mean, I hate to say instrumental, but like, yes, among other things, Jesus is so foundational, so game changing, in that like when that kind of good transmission doesn't happen, like the family of God steps in. That there's actually this principle in scripture, and really in like godly parenting, that is turning our ear towards wisdom in our elders actually trains us to hear from and obey God. Does that make sense? So like learning to respond in submission and obedience to those who are further along, who are more mature, who know more about the world, and critically know more of God, like actually like subs in for obedience to God himself. And I mean, that makes it sound like it's at odds. It's not, right? Like as we like connect with people who hear from God, like that's of deep and great benefit to us. Like it is just this like treasure trove. And actually that's not like a sub in for God. It's like, it's actually like how God designed us, that he actually wants us mostly to hear and receive him through other people. I meet with a spiritual director, and I was on a call with her last 2 weeks ago, and I got off, and it was like the most loved by God I had felt in like months. Aaron, bless you. And there was this sense of like, oh, that's actually how God intended it. So my application, like, guys, if you hear nothing else that I say, hear this. You need to find mentors now. and have more than one. Have people who can speak into your life, give them a ton of permission, like ask them questions, like don't be discouraged if they kind of like shift in different seasons. But choose people who are wise, who know God, and who like have more life experience than you do. This becomes really critical in relationship. So one of the reasons I can't give you like the 10 dating tips from HCFA or from Teal or whatever is because like you need to hear in your particular status from someone who knows you and who can like speak into where you are in any given situation. But that requires like some vulnerability, like talking about your like lust issues with the person, not always like people's go-to, like easy, like no problem, right? Talking about difficulties in intimacy, talking about like, oh my gosh, like how to like kind of emotionally connect or not over connect with someone you're dating, talking about like, okay, we're starting to think about marriage, like, or like, I'm thinking about breaking up, you know, like, I don't know if this is working. Help me figure out like what's worth like ending a relationship over. All of those things like, and should be happening for you guys separately if you are in a dating relationship and together, right? As you get more serious. Does that make sense? Any questions or thoughts? Yes, great. Great. All right. That's an excellent question. Okay, so I'm going to address that in 1 second, but just to follow up on that, I think if you go through, I'm going to read you several as if you needed me to sort of stamp on that, but those who do not hear instruction are foolish. There's nothing more foolish for the writer, for Solomon and the other contributors to wisdom literature than like shutting your ears to wise counsel, right? Or I remember being so convicted by this at one point, several points in my kind of Christian walk, is Proverbs 18:1. Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. Right? That's like, I'd rather not have that conversation because it might not go right. Like there's a control in not bringing other people in. Yeah. So, and then I think kind of the final point I want to make, and then I'm going to answer a couple of questions or attempt to answer a couple of questions. If I can find where I was. Oh yeah. It's just like, and this is kind of the meat and potatoes maybe of what you were expecting, is that wisdom looks like making steadfast moral commitments that are bolstered and enlivened and enchanted by the Holy Spirit. In Proverbs 5, there's this kind of what I think is just like this beautiful, like, I lost it. Here we go. Beautiful word coming in verse 15 and following. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. And he's talking about like chastity, right? He's talking about, hey, you're married, like don't go looking for someone else. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. He starts to sound like Song of Solomon. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman? Embrace the bosom of an adulteress. This is like old school, right? For a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. Right? There's this sense of like, hey, like, there's just an invitation to be one who makes commitments and follows through on them in light of who God is, right? So this concept of chastity is just fidelity to your season. If you're single, and you're single until you're married, like even if you're dating, you're single, you're chaste. And if you're married, you're faithful to your spouse. And your body becomes an expression of that full-on commitment in marriage, or it becomes a place of actually like fasting for a feast, whether that feast comes in marriage or whether it comes like at the marriage supper, right? Like that there's this enlistment of your whole self in faithfulness to God, right? There's like an alignment with the universe and a blessing as a result of that alignment. I mean, we see constantly in the background of Proverbs is like the tree of life, right? That symbolism gets picked up all over Proverbs. And there's this sense, right, of the garden, right? And what happens in the garden is male and female given to one another, right? And so there is this like beauty in the invitation to say like, actually, this is a really wonderful thing. This is what God has for you. It's beautiful. If it's not what God has for you, that symbolism should still be deeply integrated into your life for the most important reason, which is God's doing, like enlivening our imaginations with what he ultimately is going to do in uniting himself with the church. But you also get to be just a fan of marriage, right? Like you get to support. And I think like increasingly, guys, I understand if I were not a Christian, I don't think increasingly in our society, marriage does not make sense unless you're a Christian. I think you have to have a story that makes sense of marriage, and it just doesn't. So like as discouraging as it might be, if you are trying to follow Jesus and this is something you're like a fan of, to see other people be like, why would you ever get married? I think it makes sense in light of the prevailing notion. And so be prepared to be pretty countercultural, even in sort of the basic kind of facts around like life choices. Be prepared. I think increasingly be prepared to give a defense for marriage. And actually like the beauty of marriage. One of the things Jeff and I did when we were getting married, Tyler was there, was we were super thoughtful about the language in our wedding ceremony, which we have actually given to friends since then, because like I wanted to give us like first and foremost a defense of what we were doing, a like story that we could live into for the rest of our lives, and I also wanted other people, so we like asked everybody to like be aware that being a witness is a powerful role, right? And that they then are responsible for helping hold us to our wedding vows and things like that, right? Where we just like want to be really thoughtful about like, why bother? Like seriously, why bother? You know, like, I mean, I love a good rom-com, right? But the reality is like, like even if it just like ends and you're sort of like, okay, so what happened? Like the most interesting part is people getting together. Because like the implication is sort of like, well, hopefully they'll stay together. Fingers crossed, right? But like probably should check out now. Because like, oh, you know, I think like the biblical narrative and the life in the spirit like actually gives us this like really cool sense of like, oh my gosh, if I'm like moving towards Jesus and I'm attached to someone else moving towards Jesus, like, oh man, like that actually like makes life super interesting and exciting. and not like whatever ball and chain drudgery, all that stuff. So I'm going to stop there. I have more, but I think really like want to end with that, like investing deeply in long-term commitments and being the kind of person who does that. And here's the application for that before I answer a couple questions. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I have talked so long. Think about the ways that you are dating or not dating, operating in your sexuality, being friends with the opposite sex or being friends in general. Like all of those things as places of formation. So if we want to be people who make and keep long-term commitments by the grace of the Spirit, because it looks like Jesus, because that's what God does with us. And that's what he enables us to do, because making long-term commitments and investments is really the way of Jesus in the world. If we want to be those people, I think we need to think about how we date. Like, are we dating in a way that's like, hey, I'm just scrolling through Tinder, right? Because like I'm a Christian and I'm marked it, guys. I marked it on my profile, right? Like everybody knows that I'm a Christian. I made it super clear. They know I'm not here to hook up, or whatever. And I'm like thinking, you guys are smart people. Think about how you're being formed in some of these processes. Like, how do you talk about your body? How do you talk about the bodies of your people that you're interested in? What does it look like when you think about like, when you're making like dreaming vocationally and thinking like, well, I don't know what he's doing, but I'll tell you what, I am not going to interrupt my education, my vocation, like these ways of thinking that really are like, we're borrowing from the world and we just need God's grace to transform us. And that happens in community and it happens slowly and over time. But I think the invitation of the Spirit is to really like look at, how are we being formed by our current practices, and are they in line with where we want to be headed? Does that make sense? Something to think about. So I do want you to talk about that in your group. If you guys can like hang for 10 minutes, I still think it would be good to do breakouts. Is that okay? Sort of. Okay, great. And I'm going to answer this really quick. I learned in my Bible course earlier this year that I should live my life as if I were destined for singlehood. Do you agree with this? Would this mentality cause us to miss a dating opportunity? Oh, if we live open to dating, how do we avoid loneliness or a feeling of emptiness when we don't end up in a relationship? How do we deal with insecurities over our social lives and bodies as we get older? And some of us realize we are perhaps destined for singlehood. Oh my gosh, these are such good questions. I'm not sure. Let me start with the kind of low-hanging fruit. If we live open to dating, how do we avoid loneliness or a feeling of emptiness when we do not end up in a relationship? You don't. Loneliness is just so core to human experience. It is inescapable, I think. And I think Jesus was lonely. I think there's actually really good things that happen to us in seasons of loneliness. I think it makes us more empathetic to others. I think we, and so, but in terms of like a chronic loneliness, I think that's where sort of to what Tyler was talking about. I think we as a church just need to do better at friendship and at really like pursuing others. And so I think thinking about relationship structure, here's why I think thinking you're going to end up single is a good idea. And here's where I think it can be unhelpful. So I'm going to sort of not answer the question head on. Here's what I think can be good about it. It causes you to invest deeply in friendship. And I think that's super important. And I think it also causes you to invest with people who are already families, who like traditional families. It causes you to have friends of different, like if it moves you outward to people for a relationship, I think that's really good. If you desire to be married, here's what I hate to see, because I've done it. No, I'm cool with being single. I just really feel at peace about that. Inwardly, oh my gosh, I better never be single. This is awful. Like, right, like cut the crap. Like, if you want to be married, just want to be married. Like, it's okay. Like, that's a good desire. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen for you. It just means that it's real. And to deny it, I think, is a mess and really unhelpful, to hold that before the Lord. It's also really vulnerable to say, like, I desire this thing, and yet, like, I don't know what to do about it. And you guys are probably where you are because you were good at making desires into something that actually happened. This is something where I think there's just a ton of room for intimacy with the Lord. Just like pouring your heart out. Like, this is what I want. I'm really into that guy. I'm really into that girl. What do I do? You know, like it is going to be messy and awkward and all of those things. And I think the Lord just meets us there and doesn't, like, he's not thrown by that at all. So I think kind of, and to the body question, I have a lot to say on that, and you'll get used to that from me. Because I think embodiment is so critical, but I also think that's a thing to really bring before the Lord. And this is what I'll end here, and then you guys can, I'll send you into your groups for 10 minutes. You're such champs. A dear she graduated where she's at med school at WashU right now, and I had her all 4 years, and I love her dearly. And she is African American, and so we were talking her senior year. We had processed like a million things. We would meet up every week probably for a couple of years. And we were talking about relationships, and she hadn't dated really at all. And she was like, Teal, like, do you know the stats on like attraction related to African American women? And then like looking at like her level of education, her level of kind of perceived success into the future, which was not hard to imagine. Like, it's not looking good for me. And I was like, you know what? I hear you. Like, I hear you. And I think you might be looking at your situation going, and I did. I mean, all my Bible girls used to always say, Teal, how are you ever going to meet anyone? You're always with us, which I thought, wow, are you trying to get rid of me? And like, those things are real. And I think looking at our circumstances for what they are is actually like a good discipline. Like, we don't want to be the kind of people who like pie in the sky. That, and to hold that in one hand, but also to hold in the other hand, like, you have a God who sees you and loves you and knows you better than you know yourself, and who actually like can work any kind of miracle. And that we always hold those two things together, right? That like the reality of our situation, our perceived reality, our narrative is not discounted, but it is not the only narrative. It's actually not the overarching narrative. And so to realize that whatever else is true of your experience of relationships, that God has a bigger story going on. And whether you're going to be single or whether you're going to be married, like, your story fits into that story. Like, you have a compelling reason to be married in the kingdom, like to someone who will partner with you in kingdom building. You also have a really compelling reason to be single. And those are options. And so just continuing to submit that to the Lord, I think, is a really beautiful and important part of kind of life and discipleship. So let me pray for you, and then I want you to process this in your groups for 10 minutes, because you guys are champs. If you have to duck out, I totally understand. I think it'll be hopefully a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your awesome questions and your engagement. Lord, we love you. Lord, I thank you. Lord, I'm so grateful that it's just true that we have a bigger story, that our situation, our relationship status is not it's just not the truest thing about us, that we get to be subsumed into the larger story of who you are, what you're doing in the world, that even marriage itself has a larger story, that it doesn't actually remain into eternity, because when the greater comes, Lord, the shadow passes away. And so, Lord, would you just help us in our imaginations to begin to hope in you and in your ways. And Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters that you would give them a sense that your living into your story, whatever that is just a far better way of being in the world than any other way. And so, Lord, we need you. We need your Spirit to apply that to us. We love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, y'all. Catherine.